Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Founders Day 2024. I am Colby Reed, and I am thrilled that you've decided to join us for this conversation about Project Phoenix. For those of you who are unaware, Founders Day is actually a longstanding tradition here at the Murdock Trust. It allows us to celebrate our history going back to June of 1975. It allows us to celebrate and talk about the amazing work of the incredible organizations serving the Pacific Northwest and the common good. And it also allows us to reflect on the work and legacy of our benefactor, Jack Murdock, how that served us for the last 5 decades, how that serves us today, and how that's going to continue to inform us as we move forward. Today, I'm excited because we are going to have a fireside chat, although we don't have a fireplace in our offices, so we're going to call it a fireless side chat on Project Phoenix. And we have the Project Phoenix team with us today. We have Pauline Fong, a recent PhD, Chief Program Officer and Chief Program and Impact Officer here at the Murdock Trust. We have Jill Lemke, Vice President of Grants Management and Training, and Danielle Newman, who is our Special Project Support. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Colby.
Thanks, Colby.
Now we are, just so our audience knows, we are going to have an opportunity for some questions at the end. If you'd like to submit some questions, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A box. But Pauline, I'd really like to start with you because Project Phoenix is arguably the coolest title of any project I've worked on at the Murdock Trust in my 7 years here. But can you share a little bit about what exactly is Project Phoenix?
Yeah. So Project Phoenix came to being, I would say, about 18 months ago. And, like many organizations, the Murdock Trust, we also have to evolve and adapt to the context. So obviously, our world is changing so rapidly, and the needs of the communities that we serve is also evolving and changing rapidly. And I think there's a potential to harness some of the technological advances and innovations that are happening in order to do our work better. So part of it is it came about because our new CEO, not so new anymore, our CEO, Romanita Harrison, when she came in, she actually initiated a process for us to really do the assessment and evaluation of our current grants and programs, and also just our workflow and the design of how we do our work. And so Project Phoenix, we realized that there's actually a need for us to build on the foundation over the last 49 years. And so the image I like to use, and I've used a lot with our staff, is it's like we're taking a house and we're renovating it. And so the house is great, but it needs to be updated. So we're renovating the house, but while we're also building a new addition. So that's kind of our sectoral strategy. So we will remain a responsive funder, and we'll build on that and build the sectoral strategy with initiatives, programs, and convenings around that. And so that's kind of the image. So really, it's the image of renewal and regeneration. And so that's how that ties into the title.
I love it. And it's been so much fun to watch the process. And part of the reason why we wanted to have this session in particular, kind of over the lunch hour, was we know that there are a lot of organizations that are facing a similar challenge of needing to kind of rethink the way that they do their work, coming out of COVID, a number of organizations that have maybe been operating for decades in the Pacific Northwest. And how do you approach a renovation, a renewal of this strategy, of this scope? So I'd love if you could maybe take us back to last year. As you mentioned, it's about an 18-month process, but around this time last year, we were really kind of looking at how do we scope this out? How do we plan for this project? Pauline, Danielle, I know you also were deeply involved in some of the data that was pulled for that, but would love to just kind of go back to that phase of the process and how we scoped this out.
Yeah, so I would say the first phase really was about 18 months ago. And so it's that assessment and evaluation period. Part of it is like going back to the house image, right? You're looking at your house and you're looking at, okay, what's working well, what's not working well. And part of how we did that is actually pulling some quantitative and qualitative data that I think I'll have Danielle speak to more to because she really was our data person. And part of that is to use that data to reflect on the feedback that we've been hearing. So part of it is historical feedback that we've heard from applicants, grantees, and others, and then also through surveys and focus groups, really working with our internal interest holders, including our staff, our CEO, our trustees, and then also external interest holders, like some of the consultants that work with a lot of the nonprofits that actually submit grants to us. Some of the retired executive directors and development directors, we reached out and did focus groups. And part of that really is to just get good feedback. And we actually do periodic surveys throughout the year anyway. That's actually been a practice for a long time. And so actually looking at some of those survey results over those years and taking all of that to say, okay, what are we noticing? And part of our core philosophy here at the Trust is that we really want to invest in projects that build sustainability. And so it does require a level of due diligence, but we know that grant applications take time. So I worked in nonprofit for a long time as well, a couple of decades. And so I've written many grant applications, and we know that that takes time. And so how can we actually redesign a process that could save time, but also actually employ the technology that is now available and collaborations that could potentially collaborations that could really shorten that time, and redesign and streamline our application process while also trying to look at the sectoral strategy and how can we actually redesign our grant making and our program system to actually reflect that strategy. So really it was on multiple parts. We had to actually do that on multiple levels. And so for the first few months, we really started with reviewing some of that data. And what we found out were, I would say, 4 things. So the first thing is that we can continue to work with our responsive grant making, but as we move to the sectoral strategy and actually go deeper, we actually do have to have redesign of our program on every part, whether it's staffing or our website or our technology to really reflect that change. And then the secondly is that a newly refreshed eligibility guidelines, both for the general grants and programs and also our specific sectors, can really help clarify what the trust funding priorities are and save everybody time. And then the third thing is that a newly designed application can help get rid of redundancies and streamline the process for everybody. And then the last thing would be that the new technology could actually help us maximize technological abilities and harness that ability to streamline, again, the grant process. And so I'm going to pass it over to Danielle and see if she could just give us some information on just the data that we had to pull in order to inform these.
Right. So when I joined the Trust and I started working on this project, which were really pretty close in time, what I encountered was a very mission-driven staff, a staff that very much cared about the work that the Trust does. And it was interesting how our responsive grant process really intersected with this love of the work and this desire and dedication to serve nonprofits. And the qualitative piece of the data was that we had staff that were working over capacity in an effort to quickly process these applications. But what was more difficult to come by was specific data and information about how many grants do we process, how long does it take. Pauline and Jill had done the really good work of teasing out the average processing time for a grant, but we embarked on the process of really teasing out how many grants did each senior program officer process, how long did it take to process those, counting not just grants awarded, but grants withdrawn, grants declined, and tracing that over time to really identify the pattern and pace and tempo of the work that was happening. And what that allowed us to do was track projections, predict staffing needs over time, and also come up with what a realistic guideline or guardrail would be for staffing in terms of capacity per quarter, capacity of grants to process. And it helped give us a baseline from which we could build on this project.
And speaking as someone who was observing that process, that was one of my favorite kind of elements that came out of this, because I think it's a very important takeaway for a lot of people who are watching this, who maybe are approaching that kind of renovation in their organization, because we talk about things like burnout and staffing over capacity, and it can be this ambiguous idea. It's like, okay, the staff's working more hours, but what does that mean? How do we drill down into what does that look like? And I think that process of qualitative and quantitative, looking for what numbers you could pull together, was incredibly helpful, and then really allowed us as a team to kind of rally around making that shift. The other piece of this, so there's the grants process, and then there's the sector model. And Jill, I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about the sector strategy and kind of the decision to shift from the system that we used to have and the system that we're using now?
Well, combining the idea of overcapacity and changes and the changing community needs, we said, is there a way that we can do this better? And one of the things that we came up with is, in the past, probably throughout the trust history, we've all been generalists. Every program director, every program officer was a generalist, and you might be working on an education and arts and a healthcare proposal all at the same time. And what that's great is that it gives you a nice broad view of the work of the trust. But what it doesn't allow is for you to do the drill down and to know much more deeply, a certain subset of that of our grants portfolio. And so the move to the sector model helps us to scale, because we are a much bigger trust now. Our corpus is larger. The number of grants that we make each year has increased significantly. And what that does is it allows us to move a little more nimbly, understand our sector without having to learn, oh, here's a this sort of, application. I've never done this. Who do I need to talk to? How do I need to get my brain wrapped around this? It allows us to move forward a little more nimbly and a little more efficiently and effectively. It also gives us the opportunity to identify some gaps. What are we missing? How do we do better grant making? And sometimes it's we're looking at possible convenings or initiatives based on what we're learning within our sector. And so that sector realignment, it didn't change what we're doing or how we're doing it yet, because we're still a responsive funder, but now it's just going to a certain set of program officers, and then eventually that deeper knowledge will help us to better develop a strategy to leverage the dollars that we're investing into nonprofits in the communities.
I think to your point about the what, the how isn't different. John Castles, one of our trustees, had a great comment about that in one of our sessions this morning about how the trust, and Romanita Hairston also underscored this, the idea of evergreen donor intent really being our North Star, and the idea that we're continuing to fund the same groups, the same areas, but the back end, kind of how we innovate as an organization. That's the evolution that we're seeing. Another piece of this is, yes, we talked about, the need to scale staff and scale as an organization, but our actual grants process, our actual grants application system needed an overhaul. And would love to talk a little bit more about kind of how we approach that. And I know, Danielle, you've been digging into the data around kind of areas where we could find, time savings for grantee applicants and things like that. But we'd love to hear from any of you about kind of the grants application process.
It was interesting because the data helped us navigate the complexity of this project, because we're talking about a staffing structure overhaul. And so the minutia of how long does each step take allowed us to identify areas where we could create efficiencies. But it also helped us identify sections of the work that maybe weren't in the right position or with the right level of a position, and weren't allowing the senior program officer team to operate at the top of their license and manage the complexity of work that they really strive to do. So there's that piece of it. But then also when you look at numbers like the time to process, we really focused on how long does it take us to process from the point of an LOI to the point of a proposal and then to the grant decision. And identifying trends for that was really useful for us, and identifying the points in time where we saw ourselves going over capacity and how do we mitigate for that in the future. So the information was really, really useful for us in so many different stages of this project.
Pauline, Jill, anything that you would add when it comes to the specifics to the grants application process, kind of that whole overall piece of this?
One thing I would add is this renovation, this Project Phoenix, has allowed us to look at our actual application and what are the questions that we're asking? What do we really need to know from an applicant to make a good decision. And we found that we had some redundancies. Well, of course, renovations are kind of an ongoing process. As soon as you move to that room, you look back and say, wow, I wish I'd have done that. So this gave us the opportunity to say, what do we need to know? How can we ask that better? And what are we not asking that's really important to not only for the organization to share with us, but also for us to understand the work that's going on in this sector?
Yeah, the other thing is we had essentially one type of application that we were using for many kinds of grant requests. And so I actually think one of the evolutions that we're employing here is building out different kinds of applications that actually are asking for whatever is specific that's relevant to that type of request. And so I think that's actually cut down on some time because then we're not asking everyone to answer all the questions, but more for this type of request, answer these questions. For this type of request, answer these questions. And so that certainly does shorten it. Because I think part of the feedback that we heard over and over again is it takes too much time to fill out your grant application. So we really wanted to hear that and really take that feedback and work that into our redesign. So part of it is getting rid of redundancies, but also utilizing, and I know Joe will talk about this later, but utilizing technology to actually harness information that's already out there publicly so that our nonprofit applicants don't have to use their time to pump in that information, but actually are there ways that we can do the work of pulling that information using technology? So those are all considerations that we really thought about and tried to look at. And so that's why I think the assessment and the design phase actually took a lot of time, right? Before you even started the building and the implementation phase, that actually really took quite a bit of time.
Go ahead.
And I think that there's an interesting component in there of when do you ask the question too. The effort that went into the eligibility guidelines really helped streamline the process and conserve capacity for our nonprofits as well. When we ask the questions at the right time before it's necessary to do more work, it helps make sure that we're operating on the same page.
Yeah, and so with that, the eligibility guidelines, I think that's actually worth mentioning, right? One of the things that we notice is that sometimes our eligibility guidelines weren't all that clear. And so nonprofits would spend the time filling out the application only to find out there was something that wasn't on the guidelines that wasn't made clear. And then it's like, it wasn't an award, right? So we really wanted to minimize that, knowing that nonprofits' times are so valuable. And so that's definitely making clear the guidelines so that people aren't wasting time filling out an application if that's actually not part of trust funding priorities.
And I'll add one thing real quickly. The other thing that we had some feedback on was the amount of time our reporting processes took after post-award. And so we just took some time and said, okay, what do we need to know in a progress report? Do we really need a conditions met request, form on this? And just rethinking, what do we really need? What would benefit and, maintain accountability for, yes, this is what the dollars were for. Did you spend them on what the grant was for? But also reducing the number of reports that an organization had to submit for their grant.
So we don't want to, we're still waiting to get kind of the initial wave of feedback and do the first year of grants before we really get a sense of, the time saved. But it sounds like the expectation is an organization that maybe applied for a Murdock Trust grant 5 years ago, applying for that grant today, they're going to notice a difference in a smoother, more efficient, more time-sensitive process, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I would say because we're just in our first 3 to 4 months of using the new system, I'm hesitant to say, right, that's a small pool of data to be able to make generalizations about what exactly is it. But at least based on that small sample size, I think what we're seeing is savings of 50% of time spent on grant applications. And then again, part of what I feel like we want to build here is continuous improvement. So I don't doubt that even our current application needs improvement. And so as we hear more feedback of hey, I think that's redundant, or do we really need to ask that question? And part of it is as sectoral strategies get built out, we likely would also evolve and adapt to certain more sector-specific type of questions, right? That may also continue to help in the system and in the process. So I just say we're still what do they say? Pardon the dust. We're still under construction. I mean, we're definitely still under renovations, right? And I hope that we'll be an organization that continues to be under minor renovation, not major like this, right? But minor renovations along the way to continue to bring more efficiencies and really continue to take the feedback that we hear and then make our process better.
Really quickly, we've touched a little bit on the technology that has gone into this process. I think we all want to, she's not able to join us because she's actually running the show behind the scenes today, but we do want to give a shout out to Michelle Charbonneau, who is our director of IT and was an integral part in this entire process and has some wonderful insights that we're hoping to share on the tech side. We've talked about this being just a huge undertaking for the team. And there are some organizations that will choose to pause their operations to focus just on this work. The Trust really, we built the plane while it was in the air, continuing to do our work. Both options are perfectly valid. It's not saying one is better than the other, it's just two different flavors of the same ice cream. I like that analogy I just threw out there. That just came to me. It's very similar to the work that's done across the philanthropic sector. There's just different approaches to the work. But knowing what we know now after 18 months of kind of living this process, if you had a piece of advice to give to another organization that's about to embark on this process, what would you say to them?
Yeah, so I'll start. You all can feel free to add in. But I thought of three things. And the first one is make sure that you map the internal and external interest holders carefully and making sure to get feedback from everybody because everybody has a different perspective. And so what I mean by internal interest holders would be staff, all levels of staff that actually touch the process in any way, and even folks who are exposed to it but aren't actually handling the process themselves. Everybody has a perspective that's really, really valuable. CEO, trustees, so that's kind of internal. And then externally, in terms of our nonprofit applicants and grantees, we really try to make sure we heard from people from different sectors, different geographic locations, different sizes of organizations, different experiences in like grant writing, that kind of thing. So we tried really, really hard to hear from people from all different perspectives so that we can make sure we're hearing people's voices because there may be things that we weren't even aware of even from all of those survey data, right? So survey is quantitative, which is pretty helpful in terms of it gives you numbers, but then when you actually have conversations, that gives you another qualitative level piece to be able to really understand what's the story behind that and where are the pain points. So we really did a lot around pain points and trying to understand that. So that's the first thing is really mapping out interests, internal and external interest holders pretty carefully and listening to that. Second thing is anticipate more time needed than even your best projections. And to just expect that there's going to be glitches. And so I just remember over 18 months, we had several Friday afternoons when major glitches would happen. And part of what we needed to say to ourselves is, we expected that. That's okay. We're going to weather this one, right? And so I think to just expect that and say, if the expectation is there aren't going to be any glitches, then that's just not realistic. Glitches are going to happen. And so just to not be derailed by it, first of all, and then really watch the, I would say the momentum and the like energy behind that, because any glitch can just derail people and say, it doesn't work. Well, it's a little too early to say it doesn't work. It's just a glitch, right? And so really needing to actually manage that process. So give it more time than you think you will need. And then my last thing is just the cross-departmental collaboration is so incredibly important in a massive restructure and redesign process like this. We actually had 5 different work streams going. So there was our tech, so our IT department, communications department, people and culture, which is our HR department, and then grants and programs department. So all of these work streams, we actually met together regularly to really talk through, okay, what are we not seeing? What do we need to know? What's not working? What's working well? What's our next step plan? So even though you could have a general plan, but I think our weekly touch bases and then like working between those touch base points was really, really important because launching a new grants management system that's technology based is great. but that needed to be informed by all of the other work streams. And so that's, I would say that was invaluable. And I actually think that was really where it worked really, really well. It took a lot of time. I mean, working cross-sectoral, cross-departmentally and all this work streams, it really took time to actually spend to communicate, but it really helped us communicate well. And I think that really helped the project go well.
I think one thing that you did, Pauline, really well that I want to shout out to is recognizing places where we needed to just stop and celebrate. We're not ever going to be finished. We have invested and are committed to a continuous process improvement. So we recognize that this is not ever going to be done. But there are places along the way that you need to say, hey, this was a milestone that we just hit. Let's play a little bit. Let's take a break and let's celebrate. So way to go. That was really important because I'm just kind of a roll up the sleeves and let's just keep going. Okay, what's next? But you've instituted some really important, let's take a breather. Let's take the foot off the accelerator for a little bit. Monday will come again.
Yes, Monday will come.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. It's really easy, especially with the pace and complexity of this change, to not take that time to say, wow, we have accomplished something, even in the midst of difficult periods or glitches or problems. It's so essential to stop and do that. I think the other thing that's important is identify the places where you can get quick wins, because this was a really, really difficult project. And I think we knew that from the start, but it became even more and more complex the more we started asking questions and learning and listening. So find ways that you can see impact quickly, because that is the fuel that will help you keep going. And navigating both that short and long-term improvement was really helpful for us as well, and did give us something to celebrate when we stopped long enough to do it. And I'll echo Jill's sentiment that you did a really nice job of making sure we did that.
Great team. I mean, you got to have a great team. So that would be my last thing. You got to get a great team, and we had a great team.
Yeah, that's always helpful. This is a question that came in from the audience. We touched on that the application process itself we're looking like it's going to be significantly reduced. How does that then play into kind of the overall process of from the LOI to a grant decision? Is that window something that we're looking at and adjusting and adapting to? Can you speak to kind of how that's fit into the process as well?
Yeah, so I think maybe two pieces to that answer. So the first is previously there would be a 2-page letter of inquiry, and then so you have to write that and then wait for a decision on that. But right now with our new technology, we're able to go through an automatic decision tree, so that when you're walking through all of the eligibility guidelines in that that auto system, then you don't actually have to write a letter. So you answer questions like, are you a 501c3? Yes. So I'll keep going to the next step. And then so we kind of walk through all the eligibility guidelines that way. So I think that's one place where you can expect that you wouldn't need to submit a letter of inquiry if one of the eligibility guidelines actually doesn't fit you. So that's one piece to the answer. Second is our processing time now is way shorter. Now, because we don't have we don't shut off application receival at any point. I could say this today, and then tomorrow I could get 100 applications. So I have no idea if this is going to continue to be true. But I think because we've been able to shorten the processing time so far, and so right now it's under 6 months, so it's looking great. And my goal is for us to continue to improve on that. But again, we're still a project in progress, right? So I talked about the different kinds of applications in order to make sure that the application is most appropriate and relevant to the organization applying for that kind of grant. Well, we're still in the middle of building those different kinds of applications. Not all of our applications are built yet. So this is the result of building the plane while you're still flying it, because we're still building it, And so that's where, again, initial data, yes, but we'll just have to see.
I think the other thing I would add is, while hopefully the application itself is a little more straightforward and streamlined, there's also other pieces of it that are more automated. So Pauline mentioned a while ago, we have financial analysis is really important to our process. So two things on this. I'll do Pauline. Two things. Number one, the analysis is still really important to our process. And I would say we haven't really changed the fact that we're still going to ask those questions, that we're kind of known for. How are you thinking about your project? How is this a strategic project for your organization at this time? Why now? Why this? And we're still going to do site visits. We still do site visits. We still do that relational work. But what are the places that we can save our nonprofit partners some indigestion? One of them, we had this form that was perpetually, like 95% of the time, an issue, and it's gathering historic financial data. And so our CFO and our IT and several other people said, what if we were to generate a form based on data that is already out there from the 990s? And so they developed a tool that allows us to go in to Candid, to an organization that gathers that data, get it, generate the form, and then submit it back to the organization and say, is this correct? We got this off your 990s, anything we need to know here? And hey, we're missing this 1 year, instead of making them go back through, 4 or 5 years of their own financial data. So it's trying to be nonprofit centered in our approach to gathering the information that is important to us. And then asking the question, we can get whatever information we want, but what do we need?
Yep.
So,
Do you want to talk about the helper text? Because I think that's another,
cool
in our
thing.
new grants management system, again, it's, adopting the technology, and the helper text, I think would
Yeah.
be helpful to talk about.
So one thing that we're able to do as we're building these applications and reports is actually in the application write helper text. And we're asking this question, hey, these are some things we want you to address. And in the past, the applicant would have to go to another place on our website with all of the stuff. And so here it's right there in front of them, walking them through the process. So they're not having to refer back to another document that lives somewhere else. And it actually matches the question. So very helpful.
Yeah, and then defining terms that may or may not be accessible. And so if we ask a question, there's a term there that may be understood differently by different communities, we try to define those, right?
Yeah.
So those are just certain things that we've heard in feedback of, like, this is what takes time, right? So if you don't know what the term is, how are you going to answer the question? Then you got to get out of the system and figure out what that is. So those are some places that we're trying to add in some helper. That's what we call helper text.
Yeah.
One of the things we started with this morning, our CEO, Romanita Hairston, laid out kind of from her joining the trust 2 years ago, kind of how she's leaned into visioning the work of where we are, what we need to do, and how we can move forward in the broader context of a 50-year organization, and how we position ourselves well for another 50 years. That kind of visioning was also going on and was really in parallel and a driver of this whole process. We'd love if you could speak to kind of how that visioning that Romanita laid out for us, from very early on, how that helped inform and influence the direction of this much more tactical project.
Mm.
I mean, from my perspective, when there's a vision for that, you're given permission to innovate.
That's good.
So for me, that's the biggest thing, right? And given permission to find the data, assess the data, evaluate it, and really talk about it. Have robust conversations about what are we seeing, and what are we hearing, and then permission to look for new tools, right? New technology takes resources, and I don't mean just financial and buying the one, right? This renovation is taking massive amounts of staff hours and resources. And in some ways, if you keep things going the way it is, there's a lot of stability, and it doesn't take all the staff time and resources to actually try to create and design and innovate and build a new one, right? So I just think actually her leadership really gave space for this whole process to happen, and with the goal of serving nonprofits better, right? So
I will add one phrase that Romanita introduced and we've tried to adopt is getting a system in place that allows people to work at the top of their license. And so when our wonderful grants management team was having to make copies and upload, download, all these different things. It's like, this is not really the best use of this really great staff. How can we redeploy them in a better way? And so leveraging technology, that gave us the permission to leverage the technology and do a process renovation as well, and just say, how can we better deploy this talented staff that we have, and still accomplish the goals that we need?
Yeah. So then, having the eligibility guidelines on the website that's clear, then it frees up the staff to actually answer more specific questions that applicants may have. That's not just general eligibility, but more like, this is the project we're thinking about, and can we talk to somebody about it? Then we could shift the staff time over from answering very general questions that could be answered by a website guidelines to actually real conversations about the project, about the organization. And so we hope that then we could be more accessible to nonprofits in terms of having those kind of connections.
Well, I want to build on something you said, Pauline. You talked about the fact that we've had a system that's worked really well for a long time, and it when you step away from that can require resources, and there's kind of a hesitancy to rock the boat. If it's working, don't. One of the challenges that we have as an organization that we've really been leaning into, and the trustees in Romanita were talking about it this morning, is this idea of maintaining evergreen donor intent, and how do we stay true to who we are as an organization and the principles that have let us be successful for 50 years, while leaning into the future and the opportunities that are present there. I would love to hear, in your conversations as as you've been looking at this process, how that staying true to what the trust is and what's made us successful for 50 years, and how can we build on that? How did that show up in your conversations as a team? I know, Danielle, I'm sure that when we're talking about, in particular, the data of, here's what we're seeing, here's the messaging that we're seeing, and here's ways that we can make this better. I would love to hear a little bit more from you all about that.
I think it's just really important to remember that making things better doesn't mean that anything was wrong, right? That is the whole nature of a constant improvement, just perspective. And that's such an essential value for me as an individual, but also for the trust as a workplace. We are always seeking to do better, and we can recognize that we've done well, but once we learn more, why not apply that to doing better? Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it allows these renovations or these times of stopping and reflecting, give you time to get down to the nub of what are our values? What are we really trying to accomplish here? And I think the fact that we continue to, and this has never shifted, we want to be a premier capacity building foundation. That is what we want to do, is an invest in the capacity of the nonprofit organizations that we serve.
Yeah. And then I would say one of our values is being relational, right? So that's where I would say sometimes when people hear technology employment, it means like cold distance, like all I get is a auto message, press 1, press 2, that kind of thing. And I just I feel like we're trying to harness technology so that we could be more relational, that actually there would be more time to have those true kind of relationships versus we're having to have these calls based on your document's not in, that kind of thing. So that's where I would say we're trying to stay true to the value of relational, but trying to harness technology, which may or may not be, it might seem like a paradox, but to me it isn't.
Well, and it seems like that's the conversation that we're having kind of across the board, particularly when it comes to things like AI, where there's the perception that AI is going to suddenly replace all these jobs. Coming from the communications guy, there was a whole conversation about AI is going to replace the communication sector, and really it's not replacing anything. It's a tool that makes it easier to do the job and allows you to focus on the human elements that are most important, which is so wonderful to see. We're running short on time, and so we got time for one more question. Would love to just kind of throw the door open if there's anything that we haven't touched on in this conversation as we've been thinking about, sharing with people the process of Project Phoenix, the work that's been done, the work that we still have to do. Any final thoughts or reflections that you want to make sure that we're leaving folks with as they tune in for us today?
One thought I had, I was trying to think about what do I wish I had known 18 months ago that had I known it might have helped. Because I think, it's good to do that kind of reflection. And part of it is, I mean, that's one thing is just building in reflection time along the way, even though things are very, very busy, is actually pretty helpful learning. So in building that learning culture, the reflection piece is pretty key. But I thought to myself, I think we still underestimated how, when you're trying to adopt new technology, the level of technical acumen that people have on every level really does impact how you adopt the system. And this is where I'm personally not like, I wouldn't call myself super technically like, like I'm not that great at technology actually. So it takes me more time to try to learn and adopt something on the technology than someone who would say, like my kids who are digital natives. It just takes them less time to adopt that technology. And so I think we still underestimated that. And if I could do it over again, I might actually think through a more clear strategy around different interest holders and how to think through the technology adoption pieces even more thoroughly. Part of it is while we're trying to build the plane and fly it, it means we don't have a whole lot of time for crafting some of those. And so the more you could take time to actually plan a project, it's generally better. But I think because it's our value to keep our doors open so that our nonprofit partners can continue to receive funds, I think it's the right decision, but it also created, I think, a crunch in time. And so I think if there's ways to kind of make room for some of those crafting of those kind of strategies, I would have really liked to have done that.
Yeah. And I would go back to something that you said early on, and that is the cross-departmental communication. It has been amazing to work with Elle Charbonneau. Shout out to Elle, our IT director, because she brings something that, I mean, I don't have, but we were also able to bring the processes that we needed into her work. So really having a good communication between the IT people and the program people, that was critical. And then you got to bring in the communications people when you're saying, we need to send this out. Does this look okay? And, and even more than that, how do we communicate well internally and externally, all the things that are going on?
Daniel?
I think that I'll just add on to your comment about thinking through the bigger picture and considering the technology piece, because we had so many different technology projects happening at the same time. And how do you look at the thread of continuity through all of those projects? And how could we have approached that tech piece specifically a little bit differently? Because Pauline's right, we do have varying levels of tech acumen, just based on the different ways we've processed before. You didn't necessarily have to have it. And in the same period of time that we undertook this project, we also implemented multiple different platforms in different functional areas of the trust. So there was a lot happening. And so how do we find ways to bring people along in that and make sure they have the tools to come along well with it and maintain communication and make sure everyone understands what's happening?
Well, I just have to say it's been a delight having the opportunity to talk to the three of you. It's also been a delight observing the process over the last 18 months. Speaking from a staff perspective, you all have made this transition so. If a process like this can be easy, you've made it easy, and it has been wonderful to watch. I know that the nonprofits we serve are definitely going to be feeling the impact. Thank you again so much for your time and your participation today. It's been wonderful to have this conversation.
Thanks, Colby.
Thank you, Colby.
And for those of you who are watching at home, thank you again for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about the nonprofits we serve or a little bit more about the process of the last year, we do have some highlights of that in our annual report, which went live today, murdocktrust.org/annual report. Again, we thank you so much for your time. Please feel free to share the recording when it goes live, and we hope you have a happy and fabulous Founders Day.